past. The world before Herodotus is prehistoric. There are annals and king lists in other cultures, but not this sort of analytic effort to reconstruct the past and to see what the past reveals about the present. Because for Herodotus, in a deep sense, self-consciousness is historical consciousness. You can't know who you are unless you know where you've come from. And that whole notion of formulating who we are and of studying our past as a means of coming to know what we value, what we focus on, that too stems from Herodotus. He also, just a little plug here, has a lot of other virtues. He is not only the founder of history, father of history. Some skeptics in the past more than the present called him also father of lies because he's a fabulous storyteller, enjoys telling stories, and some of the stories are a little spectacular. But as time has gone on, archaeology has confirmed more and more of these spectacular stories. So rather to the surprise of contemporary experts, so he is no longer so much the father of lies, but more the father of comparative anthropology, because he writes with fascination and firsthand knowledge about Egypt at length, and also about Scythia, which is what the Greeks called the area of Central Asia and southern Russia and Ukraine, which was inhabited by fierce, gold-loving, nomadic horse people, some of whose women supposedly fought regularly, and evidently the legends of the Amazons come from that context. Most of our knowledge about the Persian Wars comes from Herodotus, but we have actually some even earlier testimony and testimony of high value. Most Greek tragedies, as you know, deal with mythological subjects, whether they be the House of Thebes, Cleon and Antigone, or the House of Argos, Agamemnon, and so forth. But not all. Aeschylus, for my money the greatest of the Greek dramatists, wrote and had performed in 472, 8 years after the event, a play called The Persians, which is about the Persian reaction to the Persian Wars. And Aeschylus was in a good position to know what had happened. He had fought in the opening round battle of Marathon in person. Rather than his dramatic career, it was his role at the Battle of Marathon that he chose to have commemorated on his epitaph. His brother died at Marathon, and he later fought at the naval battle of Salamis. So he knew whereof he spoke, and we have that evidence as well. Well, now it's time to turn to the players. You can't tell the players without the scorecard, and here's a scorecard of sorts. Persia. At the time of the Persian War, Persia was the biggest empire that we know of that had ever been in the world. It was huge. It went from effectively just across the Hellespont from modern Istanbul in Turkey all the way down through Egypt and west all the way to the borders of India in Afghanistan. Huge. The heartland, of course, was what we now call Iran, and that's where the Medes or Medes and the Persians originally came from the mountainous areas of Iran. This may be a good moment, in fact, as we begin to address a series of Persian names and various other Middle Eastern names, to confront head-on a problem which will be with us the whole way through this course. And that is, to the best of my knowledge, there is no agreed-upon, universally accepted way of pronouncing a lot of these names. And bear with me on this digression, because if you have ever watched shows about this time on TV, if you've ever heard other recordings or lectures on this, you will notice that people say the same name different ways. The reason for that is essentially this. Our sources are almost entirely Greek. We have very few, not zero, but very few Persian sources. And the Greeks transliterated, rather inattentively, foreign names which they encountered. Then the Latins, the Romans, took the Greek names and Latinized them, and then we have anglicized often both the Latin and the Greek names. So you got a lot of choices. You can choose to pronounce it as close as you can to how the original tongues, if it's a non-Greek or Roman name, pronounced it. You can pronounce it Greek. You can pronounce it modified Greek. You can pronounce it Roman. You can pronounce it modified Roman. Up until the 19th century, the British pronounced Latin differently than we do now. And there are all sorts of variations in between. So if I say these names differently than you've heard, I'm making a choice. Other people make different choices. Don't be disturbed. When the Persian Empire began, though, huge empire though it became, they were by no means, they were anything but the first empire in the area. Civilization, meaning urbanization based on extensive, in early instances, irrigation and agriculture, began, so far as we can tell, in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the Near Eastern shore. And the Persians had, this is really hard to believe, but it is true, the Persians had as much urban life and civilization behind them when they took over as we do with regard to the Persians. There was already ancient history, and it was thought of as ancient history when the Persians took over. It began supposedly in Sumer, right near the area around Basra in the Persian Gulf, starting, depending on how you want to count it, on how you want to slice it, whether it's extensive agriculture or cities or records or whatever, somewhere between 4500 BCE and 3100 BCE back then, and it lasted till about 2000 BCE. The Sumerians fought in very primitive-looking, by at least the little models that they made, chariots. It was not so much an empire as a confederation of, or anti-confederation of cities, some of whom got along together some of the time, some of whom did not. They were in any case overthrown by Babylon in the early second millennium, that is the whatever hundreds BCE, and the Babylonian state under the ruler Hammurabi or Hammurabi became very, very influential indeed. The laws of Hammurabi or Hammurabi, this is one of those instances I was talking about where there are different pronunciations, are preserved and influential to this day. Meanwhile, you have the Hittites, an Indo-European rather than Semitic-speaking group, from about 1850 BCE to 1200 BCE up in the area of eastern Anatolia and environs, that is to say, eastern Turkey, eastern contemporary Turkey. And then from about 1300, you get yet another state, the fiercest and most frightening, at least from my perspective of all of them, Assyria. They were absolutely ferocious warriors, the best warriors that had ever existed thus far, and in rather unsavory ways, as their art reveals. They made use of terror as a weapon. If you were captured by the Assyrians, that was a pretty regrettable situation. Their heyday came about, 745 maybe to 605 under rulers who have come down to us, among other places in the Bible, Tiglath-Pileser II and Sargon and Sennacherib and the like. They, however, were finally defeated by a revived Babylon, Babylon II you could call it, at the Battle of Carchemish in 605. And then, and now we're getting close to the Persian Empire, Babylon was the predominant power in the region. Meanwhile, a little bit further east in the Indus Valley was a series of urban civilizations going on, but we don't know too much about the contacts between the two. The remains, in terms of records, for those Indus Valley civilizations tend to be a little spottier, and they seem not to have been direct contributors to the story before us in this course, in the sense that these ancient Near Eastern civilizations were. In any case, after 605, the dominant player was Babylon. All of the groups that we have talked about controlled the Mesopotamian heartland. Hot, dry, but because of irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates, fertile for all that. Really hot, by the way. Hot as Phoenix, hot as Las Vegas, 110 degrees plus in the summer, blazing hot. The Persians and the Medes came from the mountains to the north. They were not plains people, just as the Assyrians had come from the north before them. And they were less culturally sophisticated, at least originally, than the cities of the plain, so to speak. Our story begins with one of the truly luminous figures of antiquity. You know he's a luminous figure because even his opponents and the people whom he overwhelmed have very little that is bad to say about him. Cyrus of Persia. His name in Persian was Koresh or Korash. The Greeks Hellenized that into Kyrus. That gets Latinized into Kairos, and it gets anglicized into Cyrus, and it's as Cyrus that we know him. He became a sort of semi-legendary figure, and he took control of the Persians sometime around 560, 559. A lot of ancient dates are in that slashed form, largely because various people started the year at various times. So we'll hear that something was in this year, but it's like a school year, which runs from, summer to summer rather than from winter to winter. In any case, 559, 560, he takes over. By 550, he had taken over the realm of the Medes as well, taking it, in fact, from his grandfather, who was a pretty fierce character, and the Medes and the Persians were united. Still, not a real powerhouse joint. Nonetheless, Cyrus then embarked on a series of conquests, and this is where Herodotus begins his story, most notably over the kingdom of Lydia, which is how the Greeks got involved. Lydia, with its capital at Sardis, was ruled by Croesus, of rich as Croesus fame. Croesus was purportedly the richest man in the world, and in fact, the first recorded coins come from Lydia. Part of the realm of Lydia consisted of Greek-speaking and culturally Greek Aegean islands on the Turkish coast. And Cyrus conquered Lydia after Croesus had invaded. Croesus, before he invaded, in a very famous story, had consulted the Delphic oracle, the most influential oracle in the ancient world in Delphi in Greece, as to what would happen if he invaded Persia. He was told a great empire would fall. Well, it did. His. And there's various stories in Herodotus about what happened. Supposedly he was about to be burned as a prisoner, but there was divine intervention and he became a wise advisor to Cyrus. Stories differ. But in any case, at that moment, Persia took over control of Lydia, and with it, of a lot of Ionian, that is to say, island area Greeks.